So a couple of years ago, I was in a discussion with a pastor from a rural church in central Texas, and he did not understand how I enjoyed living in the city. At the time, I was living in Fort Worth, but now we live in the Woodlands, which would be considered quite urban as well. And he didn't get why I liked that. It's too many people, it's too busy, look at the traffic, and he has a point there. Look at the traffic. But he didn't understand how in the world I could not only enjoy living in the city, but doing ministry in the city. City people are frustrating, they're difficult, you've got all kinds of different problems all mixed into one. Rural people, we're just laid back country folk who, it's okay, we don't really worry about stuff. And he didn't get how I enjoyed doing ministry in the city. And so when I answered him, I told him I grew up in Katy, in suburbia, and I'm used to the city and lots of people, and I'm even used to, it's funny saying from Katy, but I am used to some diversity. And then I turned to why I love doing ministry in the city. And the reason that I love doing ministry in the city is because the city attracts all kinds of different people. Rich and poor, old and young, different races, different tongues, different histories. It's an amazing melting pot of people. And I love specifically doing ministry in the city because of the opportunities that there are for the church. The opportunities for the church to be a city on a hill. Because what we can do as the church is we can take this melting pot, this conglomeration of people, and unite them under one banner, which is Christ, and cast off the worldly descriptors that we have, whether it be rich or poor, old or young, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever you would throw at someone to describe them. We can get rid of them and instead be united under one name. That is what excites me about the church, and especially doing church in the city, because it is ripe with opportunity. But the thing that excites me is also the thing that frustrates me the most about the church. Because for all of the opportunity that we have to show unity in diversity, we do a pretty terrible job at it. We fail miserably at unity and diversity. Did you know that the church growth movement that started in the 50s and 60s decided that it's easier to grow a church if everyone is the same? That if everyone has the same skin color and they're from the same class, it's going to be easier for you to grow that church than it is for you to try to make a church mix of all different colors, all different types of people, rich and poor, old and young. If you do that, look, your church is going to grow slowly, if at all. It's going to be difficult, and it's just not worth the time. So instead, what you should do is you should just get a bunch of people that are all the same together and call that a church. And these same people can meet here, and these same people can meet over here, and these same people can meet right here, and we'll each have our own little churches, and maybe we wave to each other on the way to church on Sunday mornings, but we don't fellowship together. And yeah, we would say, well, we're all part of the global church, but we sure don't look like it. We look like we consider ourselves one church, and you guys are a totally different one. And this morning, we're starting a new series called The All-Inclusive Church, in which I want to prove to you, biblically, we're going to look at Old Testament and New Testament texts, that this idea of separate churches was never what God had in mind. It was never what Jesus had in mind when he was dying on the cross. This idea that we would allow the world to segregate us. That instead, when he came, he meant to fix the brokenness that sin brought. You see, because of sin, we have things like racism. We have things like sexism. We don't like people from other classes. We don't like people that speak in a different tongue or because they're from a different country. There's not really any difference between me and someone in the Canadian border, except for the fact that there's a border on a map. There's not really much difference between me and somebody in Mexico, except for the fact that there's this border on a map. and yet we treat them like they're so much different than we are. That was never Christ's intention for the church, for the world to define how we should be church. And this morning, what we're going to focus on is how the church was not meant to be separate for, this church is for older people and this church is for the young people. We weren't supposed to be separated like that. It's supposed to be for all generations. And to do this, we're going to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 3. I first saw this example of Eli and Samuel in a book called You Lost Me by the Barnacle. In that book, they talk about understanding the millennial generation. If you have no idea who those people are, it's anyone born after about 1982, give or take a couple of years, to about high school age right now. So you're talking about a 20-year span. Yes, I'm a millennial. You can judge me now. It's a difficult generation to understand for a couple of reasons. Technology, in the 20 years that I'm 28, almost 30, in the 20 years that I grew up, technology advanced rapidly. Okay? And no generation before my generation has grown up with the technology that I had at my fingertips. And then when I was a youth pastor, parents were like, what is going on? I don't understand this technology. I don't get this technology. And so it was all about understanding how do we communicate with this younger, new generation that has issues and things that we never had to deal with. And in this book, they were trying to talk about the idea of not separating the millennials off by themselves, but instead let's take them under our wings. And they looked at the example of Eli and Samuel, and how both of them exemplified some key character traits. And it was just 3 or 4 sentences that they mentioned it, but I immediately read it and was like, oh, this is gold. And I went and I did some exegesis, some study for myself, and I sure enough found that this is such a beautiful story for how the older generation and the younger generation can work together for the glory of God and for the benefit at that time of Israel, but now for the benefit of the church. So we're going to take a look at what's going on, but right out of the gate, I need you to be aware of a couple of things. We're going to look at some things that both the older and the younger generations need to work on. As a person who would be categorized in the younger generation, please do not let this be a young guy yelling at the old folks. That's not what's going to happen here. All right, trust me. I'll yell at the young folks too. I need to be yelled at. But I'm not yelling at anyone. I'm not mad at anyone. I'm just simply pointing out some key character traits from Eli and Samuel that we would do well to learn from and to put into practice in our churches. So please, don't, if you're in the older generation, when you hear me kind of talking about the younger generation, how we need to change, you can hoot and holler and say your amens, but then don't flip the switch off and fall asleep during the part that's for you. Okay? Vice versa for the younger generation, all right? Let's not do that. And be careful when I'm talking about the older generation. If you're young, you don't want to be hooting and hollering because you might get an earful on and expect back ahead, all right? Be careful. It's a very interesting study. It's a very interesting look at 2 very godly men. Now, before we read, I've got to give you some backstory as to what's going on. There's no king in Israel as of right now. To this point, Israel has been led by a series of judges and prophets, but there is no king. And it's during this time that a boy named Samuel is born. And Samuel is the miracle child of a woman named Hannah. Hannah could not bear any children. And it wasn't for lack of trying. For years, her and her husband had been trying to get pregnant, had been trying to have a child, and it just wasn't happening. So she goes to the tabernacle one day, and she pleads with God, God, give me a child. And if you do, I will dedicate him to the service of the Lord. My first child will be wholly and completely yours. And God hears her prayer. and she bears a child, and she names him Samuel. And after she weans him, which in biblical times was about the age of 3, she takes him to the tabernacle where the high priest Eli serves and dedicates him to the service of the Lord. So from 3 on, Samuel works in the church. That's pretty young. I doubt he was preaching at 4. But he serves in the tabernacle. And Samuel, when he serves in the church, he's growing up and he's watching everything that's going on, and he's never going to be high priest. He's never going to be what Eli is. But alas, he sees something happening. Eli's sons, who are supposed to take over him for him, in the high priest world, what happens is the high priest dies, and then one of his sons would take over, just like a king. But Eli's sons were wicked, like really, really wicked. They not only defiled and had no regard for the sacrifices that people made to the Lord, but they also slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tabernacle. Absolutely zero regard for the Lord and the service that they're supposed to be performing. So they took advantage of their family position as priests, and they mocked God. And although Eli had heard of this and had told his sons, hey, if you keep doing this, God's going to punish you, they persisted. And so God sent a prophet to Eli and let him know, hey, your sons are wicked, and I've noticed, and what's going to happen is your sons are going to die. And with them, your family's reign as high priests ends. And I will raise up for myself someone entirely different, who is going to respect my word, who is going to be a righteous man, and who is going to rightly perform the duties of high priest. And that's where we find ourselves here in 1 Samuel chapter 3. We're going to read this whole chapter. That's right, the whole chapter. Verse 1. Now the young man Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. It's important for you to understand that. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he did not see, was lying down in his own place. The Lamb of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he said, Here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But Eli said, I did not call you. Lie down again. So he went and lay down. And the Lord called again, Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call you, my son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time. And he arose, probably annoyed, and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling him again. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant hears. Then the Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel, at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. And I declare to him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. Samuel lay until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. And Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he said, Here I am. And Eli said, What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you. So Samuel told him everything, and hid nothing from him. And he said, It is the Lord let him do what seems good to him. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall on the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Now this is a commonly known Sunday school story. If you grew up in church, you've probably heard it. And I love taking old Sunday school stories and diving in and grabbing the meat out of it. And this story has so much meat on its bones. It's a phenomenal example of how the older and the younger generations can both mutually respect and submit to one another out of reverence for God. So let me dissect what's going on here. Scholars believe that Samuel is about 12 years old. He could be a little older, according to the Jewish historian Josephus. Eli's gone to bed, and Samuel's lying down where the ark of the Lord is. God calls him 3 times, and 3 times Samuel gets up and says, Eli, I'm here. You called me. What do you want? And Eli finally realizes the 3rd time that God is calling to Samuel. Now, part of the reason that Eli may not have realized it was the Lord's voice the first time is because at the very beginning of the chapter, we got that little subnote that it had been a long time since anyone had heard from the Lord. So Eli's probably not thinking it's God speaking to Samuel. Instead, he's probably thinking, well, if God's going to talk to anybody, he's probably going to talk to me. I'm the high priest. And it takes 3 instances of Samuel coming to him for him to realize, oh, it's the Lord. Go and say this. Duh. And so he tells Samuel to go back and say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. An amazing note on this point here. Eli is the first one to recognize the Lord's voice. Samuel, as a child, does not know what God's voice sounds like. And it requires Eli to point it out to him. Older generation, we need you in the church to point out to us what God's voice sounds like and what it doesn't sound like. We need you to be there for us so that we can come to you and say, you called, or I'm hearing this, I don't understand what's going on, and you explained it to us, and you pointed out to us. We need you to be like Eli for us and tell us what the Lord's voice sounds like. We need you bad. So Samuel returns and he says what Eli told him. And the Lord tells Samuel, I am indeed going to replace Eli as high priest. And Eli's sons are going to die. And you, Samuel, are going to take their place. Now Samuel is terrified. Obviously, this is good news for him. It's awesome to get to be the high priest, but it comes at the expense of his mentor's sons. And so in the morning, Eli calls Samuel and is like, hey, tell me everything he said. Well, I'm going to put a curse on you. Tell me everything. Don't you leave anything out. So Samuel reluctantly tells Eli. And Eli's response is amazing. May the Lord's will be done. Phenomenal story. And what I want to look at as we further dissect this is the character of both Eli and Samuel. Because both of them exemplify the same 3 traits in this story that allow this interplay to go the way that it does. Because, let's be honest, you and I know how people are. We're selfish, we're greedy, we're jealous, we're prideful, and we're arrogant. I don't know about you, but I didn't hear any of that in what we just read. And that's surprising. Because normally when it comes to someone taking over for another, for someone's plans getting ruined and someone else getting to be the one in charge, there's a lot of bitter feelings, a lot of unhappy people, and some scheming and some planning that's a little off in the corner. But there isn't any of that in this story. So I want to jump down and look at these three character traits: humility, submissiveness, and a teachable spirit. Because Eli and Samuel both exemplify these. And if we, as a church, can understand, regardless of our age, regardless of how long we have or haven't been a Christian, if we understand these three traits and we allow God to transform us and make us into these kinds of people, then our church is going to reap the benefits. The younger generation is going to reap the benefits. The older generation is going to reap the benefits. This community is going to reap the benefits of seeing us be united for one common cause, for one common goal. Now, of course, Samuel is going to represent the younger generation, Eli the older. And there's a few things that you've got to keep in mind. We tend to, as a side note, we look at the interplay between the younger and the older generation here. I got to make clear that Samuel does not represent just teenagers or college-age students that are sitting in this room. And he doesn't just represent the little kids in the great room. Right? Most everyone in this room has an elder. Whether it be your parents, your grandparents. Right? Most everyone in this room has someone that we should consider an elder. Right? I have elders, and all of you say, haha, of course you do, you're a child. But if you're 40, people who are 60 are your elder. If you're 60, people who are 80 are your elder. Alright, so when I talk about the younger generation, just because you're not under the age of 30, don't click it off and say, I don't need to learn any of this. Because you do. Alright? And then also, on the opposite side, when I talk about Eli and the older generation, alright, just because you're young, don't click off and say, this isn't me. Because you could be 20 and mentor high school students. Okay? You could be a high school student and mentor junior hires, a junior hire and mentor elementary kids. Alright? So it doesn't matter how old or young you are, you can most likely learn from both sides of these stories. So please pay attention to both of them. Now, the younger generation is the one I'm going to deal with first. Samuel exemplifies humility in this. He gets told he's going to be the high priest. Like the highest job in the land. There is no king. If you're the high priest, you're the guy. I don't know what your experience is with like 12, 13, 14-year-old boys, but they don't really have a lot of humility. They're usually pretty full of themselves, and they're pretty braggadocious. I've had a lot of experience with them as a former youth pastor, and it's amazing to me that Samuel restrains himself, and in fact is afraid of Eli. He respects him so much that he doesn't want to tell him the news that he heard. I'll be honest with you. When I was 13 years old, if I hear I'm taking over for the old man, I'm like, oh, in your face, what? I'm the guy. When your son's kicked the can, I'm it. That's me. But at 13 years old, Samuel doesn't do that. He has a fear. He has a respect for the role that Eli has. That's amazing. Younger generation, we need to have some humility. We have got to respect those in front of us. If we're going to ever learn that we're the ones taking over, or we're looking forward to the day when maybe we get to lead, we better be respecting those who came before us. Because they have blazed the trail. Probably the reason you get to take over when you take over is because somebody already else did all the hard work to make that exist. And this works in your job. If someone retires and you take over for them, don't take over and then disrespect them. Be thankful for the hard work that they did so that job's even available to you when they retire. And in the church, whether it's elders, pastors, deacons, most likely those men one day will get to a point where they say, I need to retire. It's time for someone else to take over. when you have an opportunity to do so, you had better exemplify humility. And you had better honor those who have gone before you and worked for probably longer than you've been alive. Be humble. The second thing that he exemplifies is submissiveness. When Samuel hears that he's going to take over, he does not ever try to kick Eli out of being high priest so he can take over sooner. He hears years before he's actually going to take over that he's going to be the high priest. But it doesn't happen until Eli dies. Once Eli dies, then Samuel takes over. I'll be honest with you, if I know anything about the younger generation, most of us would be like scheming and like a way to kind of push him down the stairs or something like that to get him out of the way so he can take over sooner. But Samuel doesn't do that. He doesn't scheme behind Eli's back. He doesn't try to overthrow him. He doesn't try to be like, well, old man, you should just get out of my way because I'm the up and coming, I'm the new guy. No, he submits. And he doesn't just submit to God's authority, he submits to whom God has placed over him. He understands that Eli is the high priest for however long God says he's high priest for, and he will not take over until God decides so. We have to submit absolutely to God's plan. And if you get to find out you're taking over, in 5 years, in 10 years, don't you be scheming behind somebody back to make it faster. It's not our job to push God's agenda for ourselves faster. We need to be submissive to God's time, to God's plan, and to let Him move and work and say, all right, now it's time. You don't get to decide that. He does. The third thing that Samuel shows is a teachable spirit. Samuel does not, when he hears, hey, I'm taking over one day, he doesn't go to Eli and say, if I'm taking over, I don't need you anymore, old man. Obviously, God thinks I've already got it all figured out. Instead, what we read in Scripture is that he continues to learn from Eli. In fact, all the more so. I'm going to be high priest one day? Whew. Eli, teach me as much as I possibly can. Because I'm terrified. I'm nervous. I don't know how to be the high priest here. Show me, what can I do? Samuel continues to sit at the feet of Eli and learn as much as he possibly can until the day comes that God says, now you are high priest. This is probably the biggest thing that the young generation needs to get. We tend to think that we have it all figured out. We could be quite full of ourselves. We think we know better than our parents, or that the older generation is just outdated. And my generation especially, the millennial generation, we have it worse because of that large technology gap I was talking about. And we think for some reason that because we know how to operate an iPhone, we've reached the peak of wisdom. Well, let me tell you this. The peak of wisdom is not an iPhone or an Xbox. It's God's Word. And most likely, that older generation that you don't think so much of, they've got decades on you of reading it, studying it, listening to sermons on it, memorizing it. So you would do well to humble yourself before them and say, teach me what you know. They have so much life experience that you, simply because of your age, could never have. So ask them, what can I teach you? What do you know about marriage? How'd you make 60 years of being together work? You raised children, and they love the Lord. How did you do that? Because I don't think my kids are ever going to be that way. What can I learn from you? They have so much wisdom to give. All we have to do is ask. Now, it's the older generation's turn. Eli just like Samuel, exemplifies humility, submissiveness, and a teachable spirit. And I'm going to do my very best here to tread lightly, so please don't hate me after this. Eli exemplifies humility, and the fact that he does not get jealous when Samuel hears from the Lord. I want you to think about it for a moment. You've been the high priest for decades, okay? Decades. And the Lord hasn't spoken in a long time. And now he decides to break the silence. And who does he talk to but a 12-year-old boy who serves under you? Come on. I'm waiting for Eli to be upset, to be angry. God, why wouldn't you speak to me? Why a child? Who is he that you'd speak to him before you would ever speak to me? That's not what Eli does. Eli gets excited. Oh, that's God is speaking to you. All right, quick, go back, lay down, and when he calls you again, this is what you say. You see, Eli understands that God can and will speak to whoever he wants. And that just because Eli may have had a title for a long time, just because Eli's older, doesn't mean that he gets priority on God's schedule. That if God wants to speak to a child, he will. And we would do well in that moment to come alongside that child and help them understand what God is saying, instead of saying, there's no way God can talk to you. You're too young. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just imagining things. We encourage our kids, we encourage their generation to hear from God, and we point it out to them when they don't realize it, instead of being arrogant and saying, there's no way someone younger or less experienced or without the title that I have could hear from God. If we do that in our churches, we will have a young generation that can do anything. And it will be because the older generation has taken them under their wings and shown them the ropes, shown them what it's like to walk faithfully in the Lord. But if we don't, if we just sit back and say, figure it out on your own, then what right do we have to sit there and judge them for their mishaps and their blunders? We have none. And really the finger should be pointed at the older generation that failed to take a younger generation under their wing and show them what it means to walk faithfully in the Lord. Second thing is submissiveness. Eli hears that indeed his sons are going to die. And he hears this time, it's not him, that instead of it being a person who's taking over, it's going to be this boy Samuel. And Eli's response is God's will be done. And I don't know if we can appreciate how hard this is for him. You see, to this day in Eli's life, every high priest has come from the lineage of Aaron, who was the brother of Moses. We're talking generation after generation after generation. Every high priest has been in the lineage of Aaron, and it's going to now end with him. We're talking a legacy is done because his sons were wicked. It cannot be easy for Eli to hear. It ends with you. And this boy takes over. And it will be from his line from now on. But Eli doesn't respond in anger, in jealousy, in selfishness. He doesn't try to find a way to make this boy disappear. He doesn't have any of his own scheming. Instead, he just says, God's will be done. Succession plans are never easy. Having to step out and let a younger person step in is never an easy thing. We have our own plans, our own hopes for how something might go. But as I've found in my own life, a lot of times my plans usually don't line up with God's. And so as you get older, whether you're young now, you consider yourself young now, or you're just young at heart now, we need to constantly be asking, what is God's will and not what is my will. Because I find myself constantly having to do a course correction. And His will is the best one to be done. And so maybe it's in your job. Maybe you hold a title in the church. Whatever the case may be, when God says it's time to do something else, we have to be willing to let go of control. And know that God knows what He's doing. It's not our job to go, God, I'm going to rescue you because you're making a mistake with this one. He's got to figure it out. So let His will be done. The last one is a teachable spirit. And this one's a little interesting because Eli doesn't all of a sudden flip to Samuel and go, "Oh, Samuel, you know what you're doing. Teach me, O great one." Now instead, at the very last couple of verses of the chapter, you find that all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a prophet. And what that means is that Samuel had taken on the high priest's circuit. What the high priest would do is he would travel to different cities and he would offer sacrifices for there. People would confess their sins and he would serve the people in that kind of way instead of them all coming to him. What this means is that Eli has allowed Samuel to take over that role before Eli is dead. Eli exemplifies a teachable spirit in this. He understands that he doesn't have a corner on the market on wisdom. And that God can speak through other people. And so he vacates what is probably the biggest part of his job, traveling around and people seeing him as high priest, and lets Samuel do it. And in so doing, he is acknowledging, yeah, hey, you know what? Samuel's a pretty good prophet. It's hard. It is really hard when someone else shows up, even with our same age, for us to admit that they could be just as good as we are at it. And it's really difficult when you got 30 years on somebody. For you to see that they've got the potential to be just as good, if not better than you are at that. And Eli sees this in Samuel. And instead of pushing him down and saying, sorry, you can't do this, you can, once a year, you can say a communion meditation. Instead, he gives him the spotlight. And he says, let me help you. Let me give you the experience that you need so that when I am gone, man, it's a flawless transition. You take over, and it's no problem. It's not easy. And at 28, I get that. I imagine in 30 years I'll get it even more. That it's nerve-wracking when some young guy comes in and looks like you might be out of job or out of responsibility that you really like doing, but instead, it's good for us to say God's will be done. And for us to say, let me help you as best I can so that when I'm no longer here, you can be better than me at this. That's leaving a legacy. See, Eli's losing his name legacy. But by coaching Samuel, he gets to leave an everlasting legacy through the ministry that he does. It is such a beautiful interplay between generations here. One that, if I was probably writing the story, wouldn't have thought was realistic. Would have thought that people would say, there's no way that happened. But it did. And it's good for us to see these examples and take them to heart. And all of us learn humility, submissiveness, and a teachable spirit. Because if we're going to be a church for all generations, and that's what this church is going to be, both old and young, and everywhere in between, then we must be willing to set aside our pride and our arrogance and exemplify humility towards one another. Pride and arrogance in thinking that we know best will get us nowhere fast, both old and young. Instead, we should humbly work together for the good of the kingdom instead of for the good of our names or our desires. And then what we have to do is we have to submit not only to the Lord's will, but to the authorities, the pastors, the elders, the deacons that God has placed over us. Because make no mistake, they did not get their positions without the Lord saying so. It doesn't happen. No king, no president, no prime minister, no elder gets to be one without God knowing it was going to happen beforehand. So respect what God has put in place. And then we need to be teachable. We've got to understand that God can and will use whomever He likes to speak His words, and that it's our responsibility to listen when God speaks, regardless of who is speaking. If you're young, you better sit and respect the 80-year-old who's speaking, because they have so much wisdom that you can learn from. Don't sit there and say they're outdated, they're old hat, I don't need any of this, because you're doing yourself a disservice. But in the same way, when you're older and you hear someone younger, maybe instead of saying, there's no possible way they can know what I know, maybe we should say, perhaps God will speak through them today, and I will learn something because God showed it to them first. Only then can we do marvelous things for the kingdom, only when our older generations and our younger generations submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Can we be unified? We are a body. Some of us have been a body for a long time. And some of us are brand new to this. But we need everyone, old and young, to work together so that we can share the gospel with every person we come in contact with, so that God's kingdom will grow and expand. This old and young dysfunction that exists in so many of our churches has got to go away. And if it doesn't, then I'm afraid we have a fractured body. And look, I've been injured a lot. You can't do a lot with a fractured body. There's only so much you can accomplish with broken bones and body parts that don't work well. So let's take Paul's advice. Let's submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And as he says in Romans 12:10, let's outdo one another in showing honor to the other, by being humble and submissive and teachable, regardless of our age. And then, church, we will do great things for the kingdom. But do not leave here this morning thinking that you can decide to be this yourself. Recognize that all of this starts with a submission to Christ as your Lord. And when you submit to Him, He will make you humble. Oh, trust me, He will. He will make you submissive. He will give you a teachable spirit. And much more than those will be added to you. We're about to take communion this morning. And I would like to do communion differently, in the spirit of older and younger united together. If you consider yourself, I'm not going to put an age on you, okay? Alright? If you consider yourself, okay, I know I will. If you're college, you're younger. Alright? College or under, you're younger. For sure. But if you consider yourself younger, I want you to go grab someone who is your elder. This doesn't mean I think you're old, it just means you're older than them. And I want you to go take communion with them. In the spirit, in the bond of unity that Christ calls us to, and that Eli and Samuel so beautifully exemplify. So go grab someone that you consider to be important and honor them and take communion with them. So young people, that's on you. If you consider yourself elder, sit in your seat and somebody will come grab you. But let's take communion as a church family this morning. Honor both old and young generations. Father, thank you for the examples you give us in the Scripture of how we are supposed to be. Thank you for the example of Eli and Samuel and how they show us what it means to, both as old and young, be humble, submissive, and teachable. And I ask, Father, that our church would be humble, submissive, and teachable. That we would outdo one another in showing honor, that we would submit to one another out of reverence for you and what you have done. May we cast aside this worldly notion of old and young and instead simply be brother and sister and share with each other and teach each other all that we can so that the body may be edified, so that the body may grow stronger, and so that we can better accomplish your will. As we take communion, we thank you for your sacrifice, for the body that was broken and the blood that was shed. And as we take communion, both old and young together, we thank you that we get to do this week. In your name I pray. Amen. We have communion stations around the room. If you call yourself a baptized believer and you're not a member of our church, we invite you to join us. If you would call yourself a believer, this is maybe something you can just wait on. And if you have questions about it, I would ask, please come talk to me. Please come talk to me after service so I can tell you about our Savior.